Today is the sixth Sunday in Eastertide, a day when we begin to realize that we have for some time been reflecting on this great mystery that we call the resurrection. And in fact, the church has already turned our attention away from that. You notice over the last couple of weeks, we really haven't heard gospel stories about the risen Lord appearing to the disciples. Instead, the church has turned our vision backwards, because these particular passages that we heard last week and now this week are from Jesus' conversation with his disciples at the Last Supper. So that the words of Jesus that we're hearing now in terms of the gospel story, the narrative, happened before passion, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And so it would be perfectly understandable that the disciples who were hearing these words of Jesus, as John relates them to us in his story, didn't quite get what they meant. However, we have to realize also that the Apostle John is writing this story, this gospel, this narrative, long after those events occurred, long after the passion, the death, the resurrection, the ascension of Jesus, and even long after the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost. So we kind of have a time machine problem in our brains as to what all of this may mean for us. Well, never mind about that. But I do want to say something about time, because over time, language changes, and words take on different meanings. So in order to really get what Jesus is saying to his disciples, regardless of whether we think about it after or before the great events that we celebrate, the words are still critically important, because they are communicating something to those disciples and through them to us, to you, to me. So what is it that Jesus is saying? It sounds at first that he's just simply being very homey and sort of friendly. Wasn't it nice? He's sitting at dinner, that Last Supper with his disciples. They have no clue what's about to happen. And he's saying to them, I'm calling you my friends. I'm not calling you servants anymore. No, the servants don't know what the master is about. I call you my friends. Well, there's more to it than we would first imagine, because language has changed. You see, today, when we call somebody a friend, we're thinking more in terms of acquaintances, perhaps companions. Even that word itself has changed a bit. We think of people we pal around with, people who have the same interests that we may. We may like going to hockey games with them, or we may go to baseball games, or we may watch a movie, or we may do some activity together because they have similar interests as we do. And that's how friendship kind of begin and are sustained in our world, when we talk about friends in that way. But I'd like to jump to yet another historical period to kind of clarify what the meaning of friends is in this particular passage, how Jesus is using these terms for these disciples, because they would have understood it quite differently than we would when we hear that word friend. And we get the fact that Jesus is using it in this way when he makes that distinction. I no longer call you servants, I call you my friends. I'd like us to sort of drift back in time, if you will, in our jumping around in history, to go into perhaps the late Middle Ages, perhaps the Tudor period of England, when we had absolute monarchs in English tradition and had been that way for quite some time, even back into the imperial times that Jesus spoke. It was used this way. You see, because in the Tudor court, if the king gave you the title friend, that meant a great deal. What it meant was you weren't simply a pal of the king, but rather you became a close advisor. To have the title friend of the king or friend of the monarch got you into the inner circles of power and influence. Probably if you were a friend of the king, you may even have a seat on the Privy Council. And what was the Privy Council? The Privy Council was the king's special board of advisors, sort of the vestry of the day, where he chose people that he trusted, and he would appoint them to this council. And this would be the place where you could actually think you could speak your mind to the absolute ruler of the land. And it was called the Privy Council because it was held in private. No one should hear anyone arguing with the king. So in open court, that never happened. But in the Privy Council, you could have these more intimate conversations. It was in that context that the king would make a decision as to whether they would go to war or not, or whether it was suitable to levy certain taxes on the barons and the earls and so on. That this was the kind of honest and open discussion to an extent. I mean, you always had to be a little careful what you said to the king. But it was a lot freer and open than any other place when the king sought your advice. And they could argue with each other as the king sat and watched you, so that he could get an idea of how he should proceed, what would be the wisest course of action. And to be in that circle, you were considered a friend of the king. That's the way Jesus is using the term friend in this gospel story. He's saying to these apostles, you are my closest advisor. You are the people that I can be vulnerable with. You are the people I trust. You are the people that I count on. Oh, those are certain aspects of friendships, but it's not simply palling around. No, it was here that people solidified their relationships not only with the king, but with the world and society around them. Because if you were a friend, people looked up to you. People saw you as someone important. People saw you as someone with power. And so, when Jesus says, I no longer call you servants, I call you my friend. It was in this special circle that Jesus makes himself vulnerable to them. Because to be a friend of the king means to know the king's mind, to know the king's heart, to understand what's going on inside. So this is what Jesus is telling this close band of people. You are the ones who know my heart. You are the ones who know my mind. You are the ones that I trust with my very life. They didn't do that very well now, did they? Because hours later, we know the story. We just remembered it several weeks ago. They one by one began to run away and abandon him. One of them betrayed him. Another one, Peter, denied him. Well, what kind of friends are that? After he had opened up his mind and his heart to them so deeply, so profoundly. But we also know that after the resurrection, all of that was forgotten and forgiven. when he appears to them and bids them peace, shalom, wholeness. These remain his friends. But you know what's really important for us to consider is when we hear the words of that same Apostle John in the letter that he wrote that we read from today, we begin to realize that we are not only friends of the King, we are children of God. Children of God. The children of the King, the prince and princesses of the kingdom. That's who we are. And very often, the king, particularly in the times we were talking about, would take on his children to be in the Privy Council, particularly the heir to the throne. And St. Paul says in another place, we are heirs together with Christ. We are the children of God. We are on Christ's Privy Council. We are God's friends. So what he's saying to the apostles is not anything in particular. Oh, we're going to make you bishops of the church and all that sort of thing. That comes much, much later. The reality is he's saying that I am one of you and you are me. That's all this language about abiding in. So what Jesus is really teaching us today is that everything that Jesus was and everything that Jesus did, everything that Jesus thought and taught, everything that was in Jesus' heart belongs to his friends, belongs to you and to me. This is why he said, this is my one command to you. Love one another. And as we've said so many times, that love is not simply a good feeling, a kind of affection for someone. It is the kind of love that Jesus would teach them just hours after he spoke these words in John's story. When he was betrayed, and he went and suffered, and then gave his life on the cross. He made it clear. There is no greater love that one can have but to lay down one's life for one's friend. For someone who knows your heart and mind and soul and is so intimately involved with you, so vulnerable to you and you to them, that you would find the strength and spirit and character to give up your very life for their sake. This is what Jesus is talking about when he talks about becoming friends. So he bids us to be friends not only of himself but to one another. To be able to be vulnerable to one another in such a way that we would know each other's mind and heart, that we could share our most intimate secrets with one another, so that indeed along the way we would find the strength we need, even if necessary, to lay down our lives for the other. That's a very high bar. It's a very wonderful goal, an ideal. And like those first disciples, I'm afraid, at least I know from my own experience, I fail miserably at it. But I also know that in the heart and mind of Jesus, there is forgiveness and mercy and loving kindness and reconciliation. There is never a time when, even when we fail to love, that Christ is not right there, ready to hold us, to strengthen us, to forgive us, to embrace us. We can do this for only one reason and one reason alone. Because Christ has sent to us his Holy Spirit. That Spirit dwells in us, and it is that Spirit that unites us to Christ and to one another. It is through the Spirit that we abide in Christ and Christ in us, and that we abide with one another and in one another, that we form these bonds among ourselves, that we are not simply people walking through the world, but we become a community rooted in love. Oh, there's an old song. You probably know it from many years ago. Younger than I want to imagine. They'll know we are Christians by our love. By our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. Oh, that seems so nice and warm and fuzzy, doesn't it? Oh, you're a nice group of people. They care for each other so nicely. But if we understand this notion of friendship in this way, if we understand what love Jesus is talking about, that song is more powerful than we can imagine. But the world out there sees people who gather together in the name of Christ and open themselves to each other in such a profound way as to love one another so deeply that they're willing to lay down their lives. That powerful witness is what that song describes. Will people who walk by us see there's a Christian? There's someone in whom Christ dwells. There's one enlivened by the Spirit of God so deeply, so completely, that they would be willing to lay down their lives for each other. Oh, that's the way it was. They would know. They would walk by and they would see it, and they would say, my heart of hearts, that's what I want. To be part of that family, part of that group, part of that privy council, part of that reality. I want Christ. Because if that change, that transformation can be so deep and so profound, that's what I want. Because this is what carries us from this world into that heavenly kingdom that never ends. It is love, plain and simple. But a love so deep and so profound that we genuinely become friends. Friends of the King, who know his heart and his mind, who know his teaching, and know what he demands of us, simply to love one another. This is your call. This is the transformation that Christ can work in your life. This is the fruit of the Spirit that we bear. Let it be plentiful. Let it be abundant. Open your hearts today to see the love of Christ in one another.